It's terrific to welcome everyone this evening. This is a slightly different approach to our Indigenous Oration, to the one that we normally have. Marcia Langton kicked off the first one 3 years ago, and this is our fourth Indigenous Oration. It's terrific to have Dean with us this evening. It also coincides with Reconciliation Week, and it's rather significant in the calendar that we start today with the what was the anniversary of the 1967 referendum for Aboriginal rights on the 27th of May. And it will end with the High Court Mabo's decision on the 3rd of June. And it's 20 years since the March for Reconciliation. And so as we come together this evening, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians, owners of the land on which we meet here at Queen's, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, but also acknowledge wherever you might be tonight as well, the First Nations people. And perhaps I could just take this from the statement that probably Dean's going to mention a little bit later, that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and the islands, and possessed it under the laws and customs. They did this according to the reckoning of their culture from the creation, according to the common law of time immemorial, according to our science going back over 60,000 years. And we acknowledge that this evening as we come together. Could I just welcome a few people, Ian Marshman, who's president of the Queen's Council, and Liz Elridge, who is the vice president. We've also got David Vaux with us, who is the principal fellow within the college. And another visitor this evening is David Lawrence, who I think, as we mentioned, does a lot of work with the Indigenous Literacy Foundation as a former Deputy Archwyvern. We may have a few others joining us. We hope Marcia, perhaps Richard, and I hope also Sean from London, if he hasn't slept in. So we might see their heads pop up. But I won't say any more about Dean. I'll hand over to Stephen Wiley, who's had a hand in helping to arrange this, one of our students. He will introduce Dean. We'll then listen to Dean. We'll have a Q&A time, and then I'll ask Jess Alderton, who will end the evening by thanking Dean. And Jess and Luke, who are with us this evening, have played an enormous role in putting together a terrific programme for Reconciliation Week within the college. So maybe I might take this occasion to just thank Luke and Jess for the work that they've done, and hand over to Stephen.
Thanks, Stuart. So I just want to give a quick introduction to Dean, hopefully make him blush. So yeah, in May 2017, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples made the Uluru Statement from the Heart. This built on decades of activism in pursuit of constitutional reform and self-determination. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have reached out to the nation in a heartful effort to create a movement for a better future. Dean is an experienced independent management consultant, and he has worked across the public, corporate, not-for-profit and political sectors. He has advised a range of clients on strategy, engagement and co-design, including the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Palladium, Coles, the Referendum Council and Joan. In addition to extensive experience in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, he has commercial experience both in Australia and the UK. Dean is also from the Quandamooka peoples from Minjerribah, or known as North Stradbroke Island in Queensland. He was involved in the negotiations leading to native title determination in 2011, and continues to work with his community on this journey. As of recently, Dean is now the director of the From the Heart campaign, a a new project that seeks to unify support for constitutional reform and get it back on the political agenda of the Australian government. Tonight, we have the pleasure to host Dean, who will elaborate on what the Uluru Statement from the Heart means and the need for First Nations people to have a constitutionally enshrined voice in Parliament. Dean.
Thanks a lot, Stephen, and thank you, Stuart, and all of you for having me here tonight. Great pleasure to be here. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Gimwoy, Wallabara, Yidinji, and Yiddiganji peoples of Cairns. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And as always, I bring greetings from my peoples, the Quandamooka peoples, as Stephen says, from Minjerribah or North Stradbroke Island, just off the coast of Brisbane. Stephen's given me a great introduction, so I'm not going to go further into my history. People can look that up on LinkedIn if they're interested. First of all, I'd also like to say, just acknowledging that we are in challenging times, all of us right now, and just my best wishes to yourselves and your families, and hoping that you're all staying safe and well throughout this time. When Stuart first asked me to do this oration, I've been reflecting on how much times have changed since the end of last year, and obviously coronavirus is definitely part of that. But also professionally, at the time, I was working as a junior investment analyst with Stephen's father's company, Tanara Capital, based in Melbourne. So to think now that I'm the director of a project whose aim is to win the hearts and minds of more than 8 million Australians in pursuit of constitutional reform for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, it's a big change, but absolutely a task that I'm very much looking forward to and sharing some of that journey with you tonight. It was interesting, Stuart, when you mentioned that today is the anniversary of the 1967 referendum, and you said that Reconciliation Week this year will be finished by Mabo Day. Both those dates have significance for me. Obviously, 1967, the last time the Australian people voted in a referendum on issues relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I'm 100% engaged in making this the next opportunity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the nation to have their say this time. But as Stephen mentioned in the introduction, Mabo Day has significance for me too, given that my peoples have gone through a native title determination. It was a very, very challenging process to go through. In some ways, a very unsatisfying process going through it, and even when we get it. And I know native title has split views amongst many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and others around its benefits. And I was talking to someone the other day who it's fair to say has a fairly strong opposing view about native title. And for me, the challenge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are facing is this. None of us have ceded our sovereignty since Captain Cook first visited these shores in 1770, since the first fleet in 1788, Federation in 1901, the 1967 referendum, Mabo and the Native Title Act in the early 90s, and everything that's happened since. Not a single Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person throughout that whole time, either voluntarily or legally, has ever ceded their sovereignty to their country. But the problem is not whether we've still got our sovereignty or not. The question for all of us is to the extent to which we can enjoy it, the extent to which we can exercise our sovereignty in a meaningful way, can exercise our sovereignty with relation to land, with relation to culture, with relation to our connection to country and to each other. So all of these questions about native title, about treaty, about constitutional reform, about all the other changes that our people have sometimes argued amongst each other about, all they are is us trying to find the best way, the most effective way that we can genuinely, deeply, and over the long term, enjoy, exercise, and share our sovereignty amongst ourselves and amongst the rest of the nation. Jawa Yunupingu, one of the Gulmarch elders from northeast Arnhem Land, really spoke eloquently about this a couple of years ago, where he said, our sovereignty is not about exclusion. It's not about putting up a fence and saying this is ours and you stay out. Our sovereignty, in the way that we think about it, is a very welcoming concept. And our challenge as we move through all these different processes is to find a way for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty to coexist in a generous partnership, in a generous relationship with the sovereignty of the Crown. Nobody is realistically saying we need to wind back everything that's happened since the first fleet. We've got to find a way in such a way that our sovereignty rests and exists in a peaceful accommodation with the sovereignty of the Crown of Australia. So that's the challenge we all find ourselves in everything that we try and do in terms of change, in terms of reform, and all the advocacy and activism that's happened over the many decades. Yesterday was a really important day for me, the 3-year anniversary of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I was also in the process of launching a campaign, a national campaign, and dealing with media and dealing with everything, the craziness that comes with a startup campaign, which is an experience you just don't really understand until you're right in the thick of it, which I am right now. And in and amongst all the strategy, in and amongst all the planning and campaigning and tactics and research and everything that goes on, it was an extremely emotional day. To think that 3 years ago, 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from all over the country met on Anangur land in the centre of our nation to try and reach a consensus, on this question that had been asked through the decades. What does meaningful recognition look like to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? What does meaningful structural reform look like to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? And to play a small part in that was something that even now, as I'm talking to you, in all honesty, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I still get goosebumps of what that day actually felt like. Just to imagine the tension that was in the room, the uncertainty. We weren't really sure what was going to happen before the statement was read for the very first time, because we'd entered that conference having spent the last 8 months touring around the country, talking to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in 13 regions across the country, from Hobart to Thursday Island, from Rudy Hill in Western Sydney, all the way across to Broome in the Kimberleys, and everywhere in between, talking to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about what meaningful change looked like to them. And it's fair to say throughout that process that there was a fair bit of cynicism as we went around. This isn't the first time we've talked about these issues. We talked to some pretty old people, our old experienced people that have been around and have seen numerous initiatives come and go over time. And here we were yet again asking them to dig into their cultural, emotional, intellectual reserves to try and come up with the best possible proposal to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution. So it was an immense process to be part of. There was a period there of about 4 months where we were back to back every single weekend in a different part of the country, speaking to people, listening to stories, and every single one was different. Every single one had its own story, its own history. This is the thing that's really underappreciated, I think, by many. particularly people that work in Indigenous affairs, that there's this a lack of understanding of the deep diversity that exists amongst our people. The issues that you talk about in Redfern, for example, are fundamentally different to those that you speak about in Kununurra. And so understanding that diversity, understanding what that means for our people on the ground is actually really important. One of the things that always struck me as amazing as I moved through that process was we keep getting told, largely by non-Indigenous people, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aren't interested in constitutional change. That, you know, this is something that only elite people in the cities, East Coasters, probably people like me, are interested in. I can tell you this: I've got other pursuits in my life that I'd rather be chasing than constitutional change for my people. But the fact is, the need is there, and that was recognised every single place we went. But again, the question was, what's the best way? What's the best way? What's the best mechanism? So my role in that process was to quite literally stand at the front of every single room. There were rooms of about 100 people from all over. The workshops went for about 2 days a piece, and my role was to capture the stories, to hear the stories, to hear the hope, the challenges, the grief, the ideas of people who have been working in these spaces, living and working with these challenges for so many years. And it was a great privilege to hear all of that. It was also quite emotionally challenging for me. When you're doing a job like that, you're trying to take yourself out of the picture. It's not about you, it's about them, it's about their stories, and it's about you capturing and dignifying their story as best as possible. But it's impossible to stand there and not be affected by it. It's impossible to stand there and not hear about some of these stories that people were telling you about their families that are here now, and their families that are sadly no longer with them. And I remember speaking to Megan Davis, Professor Megan Davis, who was one of the key people who helped drive the referendum council work and the creation of the Uluru Statement. And we were speaking about a month after it had all finished, and we recognised in ourselves that we were actually experiencing a kind of trauma from that repetitive listening, that repetitive emotion that flows through. And as I'm standing there at the front of the room, and the words are flowing through you onto the whiteboard, capturing, some of it sticks. Some of it sticks with you. You can never fully let that go. And so when people challenge me sometimes about the Uluru Statement and say, well, this was just something that comes from a certain group of people, or there's only a handful of leaders that really dictated what the statement of the Uluru Statement from the Heart actually says, I get an emotional reaction to that because I heard the words, I heard the stories, I felt them as people shared that. So I look at what came out of the Uluru Statement after that sort of 8-month period, and 3 days of just intense debate, unlike anything I've ever experienced, and I'll go a long time before I experience anything like that again. For the mob to come up with the eloquent, sophisticated, nation-building statement, 440 odd words that make up the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It was a magnificent achievement, an extremely generous one. I'll just quickly talk through the Uluru Statement and what it does, and then talk about where we're up to now. So the Uluru Statement does a couple of things, and I think this has been probably not as well as understood as the key reforms that came out of it. So the first thing it does is it asserts First Nations sovereignty. It says this sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. So when people ask me about the Uluru Statement and its impact on sovereignty, I say the very first thing that the statement does is it asserts, it reasserts First Nations sovereignty over this land, and it says that it does exist, it does coexist with the sovereignty of the Crown. And our challenge is to find a graceful and meaningful accommodation between those two sovereignties. The second thing it does is it outlines some of the key challenges that face Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. It talks about children in out-of-home care. It talks about the incarceration rate, and it talks about youth detention. And I could shock and bore you simultaneously with stats around those two things, those three issues. You know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are literally the most incarcerated people on the planet. Not African Americans, not any other peoples on the planet are locked up in jail at a higher rate than Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Adult population is around 2% of the Australian population. We make up close to 30% of the adult population in prisons around this country, which is, what is it now, 29 years after the 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. The numbers have gotten worse. With regards to children in out-of-home care, we all remember the Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's wonderful apology to the stolen generations in 2008. Since then, the number of children in out-of-home care has doubled. And a report found last year that if we stick to the status quo of what we are doing in Indigenous affairs, that number will double again in the next 10 years. So as wonderful as that apology was, the problem's getting worse. And so you see, you know, the Uluru Statement talks to these challenges, and if we ever needed evidence that there genuinely existed this gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, when the Prime Minister and the Chief Medical Officers and the National Cabinet gave their health advice earlier this year, it was very stark. They said, if you are an Australian with a pre-existing health condition, you should exercise strict self-isolation and quarantining measures from the age of 60. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, that age is 50. It's a 10-year gap because our people die earlier. That is the simple fact. So when I hear people talk about constitutional recognition perhaps being somehow an argument of inequality, we're giving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people something special, I talk about that equality and say that's the real equality or inequality that exists in this country. So it talks about sovereignty, then it talks about the challenges. Then it outlines three really key reforms. It talks about voice, treaty, truth. The first one being a First Nations voice to Parliament that is enshrined in the Constitution. I'll spend a bit of time on this because that's the focus of my work now. This isn't a new idea. Let's be really clear. We've had voices to government, voices to Parliament over the decades. And the challenge with all of them is that they were all vulnerable to abolition. There was no security for those organisations. And sometimes they had to speak some really hard truths to power. They had to talk about these issues like that a third of our people live in poverty, that the incarceration rates and the suicide rates, and that makes power and people in power sometimes very uncomfortable. And so those bodies don't have any security, and they're often abolished. Even in the case of ATSIC, you can't even really mention that word anymore without invoking the spectre of Aboriginal corruption. Well, the simple fact was, yes, there were some people doing some things they shouldn't have, and that needed to be dealt with. But we don't approach it in the way that we approach other institutions in this country that do wrongdoing. When bankers make mistakes, when bankers break the law, when bankers do terrible things to their customers, those bankers sometimes don't even get fired, but there's a big process to go through and reform those institutions, whereas in our space, they just get abolished. So the constitutional protection is really important, because these issues that we're talking about aren't going to be solved over the course of one electoral cycle. They're intergenerational. We need continuity and we need certainty to ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices are feeding in at the right levels of policy and lawmaking in this country. The second reform was Macaroni Commission, and it would do two things. It would oversee a process of treaty making, and that treaty making is really about this final settlement that we need to make. And this is where this settlement, this reconciliation between the sovereignties of Indigenous people and the Crown comes into play. How do we come to an agreement? And Makarata is a Yolngu term from Northeast Arnhem Land, and it means coming together after a struggle. And it puts a different perspective on treaty making. This isn't just a transaction. This isn't just it isn't like a paper transaction between two parties. There is a full process about the way that the party should come to that. And I'm not going to talk about the intricacies of that and the sophistication of that process. It's a Yolngu term. Galaroi Yunupingu wrote a fantastic article in the Monthly a few years ago. I would highly recommend you all read that article. It is it's a significant piece of Australian writing that we should all understand well. But you can find out more about Makarata and that. And the last thing that the Macaroni Commission would do would be to oversee a process of truth-telling. And over the last couple of years, many people have come up to me and said, well, the voice is pretty hard and treaty's pretty hard. Why don't you start with truth? Why don't you just start with truth-telling, and we'll get one away, and then we can then wrestle with the other reforms. Well, in my view, truth-telling is the hardest. Truth-telling is absolutely going to be the hardest thing that this nation goes through. And I think the recent example of what's happened to old Uncle Bruce Pascoe when he starts speaking truth, the assassinations that have happened on his character and his people, has been a pretty awful experience. And I think truth-telling is more than sharing stories. It's more than just understanding the history a little bit more. Truth-telling is something that needs to be institutionalized in this country. We see it in the way that the police respond. We see it in the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths in custody still occur today. It's because we as a nation haven't fully come to terms with the truth of our history. We haven't come to terms with the way that this country was founded, was colonised, the brutality that was given to not just Indigenous people, but the non-Indigenous convicts that were here as well suffered terribly throughout that colonial period. And it has been something that has haunted us as a nation since. It's a blind spot in our understanding of ourselves and our identity as Australians. So truth-telling is going to be a very, very hard process. And for us to do that properly, we need the institutional mechanisms in place. This isn't an organic, community-driven process. There will be some of that, but there will need to be an overarching framework that we can actually fully and finally tell that truth. So voice, treaty, truth. That were the three reforms that came from Uluru. And then the final and very important thing that the Uluru Statement did is that it issued an invitation to the people of Australia. That's why the Uluru Statement is not sitting on the wall in Parliament. It's not sitting in the Prime Minister's office. We did not address it to the politicians. We did not craft it as a submission. We didn't craft it as a petition. If you walk through Parliament House, you can see previous petitions, the Yirrkala Bark petitions, the Barunga Statement, decorating the walls of Parliament like just pieces of artwork. They're not artwork. These are serious structural reforms. These are icons of Australia that have come from people absolutely striving for and driving change for their communities, and they're hung on the wall as decorative pieces. The message, the ideas, the reforms that are contained within them are just ignored. So there was no way that we were going to do that with the Uluru Statement. There was no way that this was going to be a pretty piece that sat on some politician's wall, unanswered and unacted upon, which is why it was issued to you. It was issued to you, the people of Australia. And it's an invitation. It's an invitation to you. And so that actually means something for you. You have to respond to it. It's actually not something that you need to sit back and say, well, I've got to wait for the politicians or other leaders to tell me what to do. It's an invitation to you, and you have a responsibility to respond to that invitation. And that invitation is to walk with us. Walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. So that was 3 years ago. So, you know, a lot of that was going through my head and my heart yesterday as I was reflecting on the anniversary of the Uluru Statement. So where are we now? So I'm obviously yesterday, having launched this project, we're in the process of saying the time is right now to really drive public awareness and public understanding of the Uluru Statement, and in particular the need for a voice to move us closer towards our real goal, which is a referendum. We've done some research about where we are right now with the current situation, the current context with coronavirus, as well as where we are with public attitudes towards the voice. Just with the coronavirus, this isn't our research, but the guys that we've been working with have been generous and shared this with us. Coronavirus has done a couple of things with the Australian people. One, it has shown what happens when ideology gets sidelined in pursuit of the common good. When our leaders and decision makers put aside the Canberra bubble, the games, the ideology, and actually act in the public good. They've seen that. And it's been interesting how some of the think tanks, both on the left and the right, organisations like the IPA and others, have been completely sidelined throughout this process, because this isn't a time for ideology. This is a time for caring for people and actually acting in the common good. So that's been one thing. The second thing that people have noticed is that what we can actually achieve when politicians listen to the experts, when politicians listen to those that are on the front line that know these issues better than anybody else. So for us, we think, well, the Uluru Statement is absolutely not about ideology. The Uluru Statement is about reform and change, and it speaks to all Australians, no matter which side of the political divide you are. It ignores that entirely and invites all of us together. And also the voice to Parliament is about our experts, people in community, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who know and understand their issues better than anybody else. So we're saying, let's give our experts a voice. Let's bring them closer to decision making. Let's give them a voice to the Parliament, and we will see better laws, better policies, money going to where it's needed, and some of these really tough systemic issues finally being addressed in a proper way. So while coronavirus has obviously presented some challenges, there's some opportunity there. So the public support research tells us that if we were to hold a referendum today, about half of Australia would vote yes. which is in the absence of an orchestrated campaign for the last 3 years since Uluru, hugely encouraging. We know that about a third of the remainder has yet to make up their minds. Sorry, a third of Australians have yet to make up their minds, and there's some positive indicators that sit there. And we know that those that are outright opposed to a voice is actually a very, very small number. So we believe that with a targeted, open and inclusive education campaign, we can really start to raise the awareness and therefore raise the support, because that's the other thing that the research finds, is that when people are aware and understand what we are talking about, they are more likely to support it. And that sounds obvious. But what that means for us is in this time where we are restricted from community engagement and getting our feet on the ground and talking to people, that we do have an opportunity to put information into the space to help educate and raise that awareness about the Voice Uluru Statement, because we know that over time that translates to support. So yesterday we launched this education project. It's a digital project. We launched a website and associated social media channels, and our task is really to just to build that over time. We're very aware that there are still sensitivities around coronavirus. It's not the time to be launching off fireworks and bells and whistles on a fancy campaign. That would be tone deaf and not respectful of the context we're all operating in. But there is opportunity to put information into the space for people to really understand that this is an entirely fair proposal. It's a very practical proposal. It's a unifying proposal. It brings all Australians together, and that this is the time for us to do it. I just want to finish on, and I was going to talk about this a little bit more if Marcia was here, but she's been heavily involved in the government's process with regards to looking at what a voice might, how it might be formed. If there's one real message that I'd like you to take away this evening, it's probably this one. We've faced some pretty strong political headwinds over the last 3 years since the Uluru Statement was created. We've had rejections, and the former Prime Minister Turnbull is out there flogging a book about some of this stuff right now. And I think it's come to into some people's minds that that we've got no chance, that the door has been shut. And I'll be honest with you, one of the things I'm learning as a campaigner is probably your most important job out of everything is to give people confidence that what you're doing is possible. We can do this. I genuinely believe that. But there have been times over the last couple of years where I've felt pretty challenged by our political situation. But the reality is, the Prime Minister gave a speech this year in February for the Closing the Gap, to mark the Closing the Gap report, which yet again demonstrated that only 2 out of 7 of the targets aimed at closing the gap are on track to be met. So we've still got a long way to go there. But what the Prime Minister said was this: there's a 2-stage process to a voice and to a possible referendum. The first is a process of co-design. So that's what Minister Wyatt and Marcia and Tom Calma are co-chairing a process right now to do that process of co-design. So that's going to look at what the structure might look like, how it might be represented, what the functions might look like, so we can have more confidence that this is fair, practical and safe. There's nothing to fear here. So that process is happening. But what the Prime Minister also said was, once that process is complete, we will then look to the constitutional and legislative arrangements to enact the voice. And I think that comment has gone largely unreported and very much misunderstood. And for us, I was listening to it live and I thought, there it is. There's the open door. That's the place for us to push on. This co-design process is happening now, but once that's done, we then look to the constitutional possibilities of what of enacting around the voice. So the message I'd like you to take away is this is very much a live option. The campaign that I'm running right now is about educating people about that, but saying it's up to us now, not to sit back and wait for political happenstance to just dictate what's going to happen to us. It's up to us now to influence that process. And the best way that we're going to influence that process is show a groundswell of movement of the people of Australia in support of this. So that's my task. And mine and amongst other leaders that I'm working with very closely on this is to push on that and build that momentum, so that when we come into that conversation around the constitutional provision to bring the vision of the Uluru Statement to life around the voice to Parliament, the politicians will look around and they'll see 60, 70% of the Australian people in support of this. And numbers will show the Australian people consider this fair, practical and safe, and that will be the message that they hear. So in terms of supporting this, I'm happy to talk about it afterwards when we talk about questions. But for now, it really is about getting on, spreading, sharing the information about our website and our social media. It sounds like a really small thing, but we're in a numbers game right now, and the more that we can drive, the more traffic, the more interest, the more people that are signing up, liking, tagging, sharing, tweeting. That's going to be a really critical component of us pushing this forward. So I might just pause there and leave open the floor for questions, because there's a fair bit in there. But I hope that's giving you some idea about where we are right now.
Thanks, Dean. Stephen, I don't know if you received any questions, but if not, we might just go straight to taking some questions, if anyone's got a question they'd like to ask. Stephen.
Yeah, I've got a few. So, so if treaty was to occur, how would the legal system recognise and not impede the sovereignty of First Nations peoples? And could there ever be a government with two judicial systems?
Oh, geez. That was asked by a constitutional lawyer, surely, of which I am not. Sorry, can you ask the first question again? I got really thrown by the last one.
If treaty was to occur, how would the legal system recognise and not impede the sovereignty of First Nations peoples?
Recognise and not impede. Yeah, that's a really good question. I can't give you a legal answer on that, because I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a treaty expert per se. It's an interesting question. I have spoken to some of those that are in that space, and there are levels of treaty that can be struck. So I mentioned in my talk that treaty is about the mutual recognition of sovereignty. There are other treaties that have been struck around the world that strike an agreement between the parties, but actually leave open the question of that mutual recognition of sovereignty itself. So it's possible to strike a treaty without actually coming to a reckoning on that question. So that's one thing. The thing with the treaty, and I think there's two parts to it. There's the legal part of it. There's the agreement. There's the contract, if you like, that exists between the two parties. But the really important thing about Macaroni is it talks about that process of coming to the agreement making process. It talks about the relationship. So the relationship is as important as the physical agreement between the two. If we just rely on a contract and we haven't actually shifted the relationship between the two parties, it's not going to be all that effective. And we are going to have these challenges around the protection or exploitation of the sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So part of this is about approaching it. And that's why I get a little bit sketchy sometimes when I hear governments, and particularly state governments, just say, well, let's just run this treaty process out without doing the groundwork on the relationship piece first. I think Victoria has definitely got as close as any of them in terms of doing that work. But just the document, just the agreement by itself is not going to be enough to hold that relationship properly. It needs to be about the humanity of the parties coming to that and recognizing that in each other as much as legal concepts of sovereignty and those sorts of things. And will there be two judicial systems? I think that's probably, I mean, that'd be a question for those agreements to explore. I think for me personally, treaty making has to be done with the various levels of government in play. Just having a state-based treaty is somewhat leaving open the gate for the feds to completely bypass it and carry on their own merry way, and vice versa. So whether parties choose to say we want different judicial systems as part of a treaty making process, I think is for the parties to determine as they work through that, in my view, in my very inexpert view on these things.
Thanks, Dean. I've also just got another question. So the Uluru Statement at its core is a challenge to the concept of the nation of Australia itself. Do you believe that Australia can reconstruct its identity, given that we refer to the nation as a young country? So like take, for example, the national anthem. It very much talks about how we're like a very young country, and like it was only born like 200 years ago, that sort of thing.
The short answer is yes. I do think that we can. I don't underestimate how difficult this is going to be, and it comes to, this is where the truth telling stuff is so hard. To your point about the anthem, look at what happens to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander footballers when they choose not to sing the anthem because they don't recognise it as a young and a free country. The attacks that they get from the public and the football commentariat and all those sorts of things on something as simple as them exercising their free speech shows that this is a deeply ingrained sense of truth in Australia that absolutely needs to be challenged. So I think we can. I place great faith in the younger people. Sorry, older people on the call. We need you too. I'm not giving up on you yet. But the young people coming through and the education that they're receiving and the way that they are being taught about these things is different to when I went to school. I think they're going to approach this in a far more inclusive, far more, dare say it, visionary way than our current generations who struggle with it somewhat. But I do have faith that is absolutely, we can have that conversation around identity. I think my experience with this is on a very personal level. When I have those conversations at a personal level, the initial response from some people can be a bit challenged. But when you sit down and take the time to talk about what's on offer here, in terms of a deeper connection, a deeper understanding of what it means to be Australian, what it means to be on this country right now and connected to its story, actually people there's a high appeal to that. People want to know more and want to understand what that means. The idea that you can have a connection to this country and its story that has echoes of what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people feel is something that people want. So I think we can absolutely make that happen. One thing I'll just say, in my experience with some people, when we start to have these kind of conversations, it's natural to feel defensive sometimes. It's natural to when the truth of how you've understood and the way that you've been taught about Australia identity, about your connection, your place in it, you can feel challenged. You can feel a little bit of heat, a little prickly heat inside yourself. Go, oh, that's not quite right. All I'll say is, and I'll ask you, is just to sit with that and let that be okay. It's okay to be challenged. It's okay to feel that. Don't feel angry. Don't reject it. Just sit with it for a little while, because that's necessary. It's a necessary part of challenging the truths of how we've been taught around our sense of who we are as Australians and our connection to this country.
Stephen, is that it for your questions? We might take a couple of others if anyone's got any questions.
Hi there. Is my mic working?
Yep.
Oh, sweet. I was going to ask, why do you think that there's a portion of Australia that is dead set against the idea of some sort of referendum to get recognised in the Constitution? What do they stand to lose, in your opinion?
I'd love you to ask that question of them, because look, I just think that's part of society. I think that's part of any group. There are going to be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who will say no to this, and that's okay too. Don't get scared off when that happens. This idea that, if the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can't sort them out and get united on this, then it's not worth doing. It's just a fallacy that's perpetuated in this country. We get a level of unity imposed upon us, or an expectation of unity imposed upon us, that is not imposed on any other sector in this country. And I understand that some people become a bit hesitant and a bit fearful about advocating for issues when they think, oh, well, but that fella over there doesn't like it, so I better not support it then. I heard someone say the other day that, only 90% of people at Uluru supported the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And I went, 90%? If you won 90% of the vote in an election, you'd be in power for 20 years. So, it's just a fallacy. And I'll be honest, that makes it a bit tough sometimes. I've got to walk into rooms and I've got to walk into situations where there are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that disagree with me, and they disagree with me very strongly on some of this stuff. But I believe in it. So that's my job. I've got to do that. But there are going to be times where, if you believe in this, and you accept the invitation, and you say that this is something that you want as an Australian, not just for blackfellas, you want this for yourself as an Australian, you might walk into a room or into a conversation with an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person that disagrees with you. The challenge for you is to respect that difference, but still be okay with taking the position that you're taking. It's no good just saying, I'm not going to support this because someone disagrees with me, because that gives you a get out of jail free card on every single debate that we have. So when that disagreement comes, be okay with it, be respectful for it, but we're going to win this with conviction and belief. And if that's what you have, then that's going to be part of the challenge for you to advocate for that going forward. But look, when I saw the numbers, I thought, that small percentage, 10% already definitely no. I was thinking it's probably going to be more than that, so I'd take 10%. I think that's not a bad place for us to start.
Thanks, Dean. Ruben, I think you had a question.
Thank you. Thanks, Dean. I was just wondering, I noticed in the statement, it talks about the coexisting sovereignty of First Peoples and the Crown. And I guess I was just a little bit surprised to see that willingness to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Crown and to sort of try to find that coexistence. And I didn't necessarily expect the statement to try to deny that sovereignty, but I also, perhaps it could have just not talked about it. And so I'm just interested in the sort of, was that a challenging concept to reach consensus on, or was that something that the conference felt was a necessary, or I don't know?
I think it speaks to two things. It's a really good question. I think it speaks to two things. One, there is the pragmatic side of our mob. It's just there, right? We can wish it away. I don't even really think many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do wish it away. Their identity, many of us, I've got a white Australian father. His story is part of my story, and his story has a different connection to this country to my mother's. So it's a daily, often uncomfortable exercise of reconciliation, walking in my shoes every day. It's not just a week. So there's a pragmatic reality of that is our situation, and we've got to find a way to accommodate the two. Just blindly wishing one away means we'll be in a perpetual state of unease between the two. So there's that pragmatic side, but then there's just the enormous generosity side, and it actually goes further, the Uluru statement, than just saying, well, there's coexisting sovereignty. It says with substantive structural, with substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. So it doesn't just say that the two exist side by side, we've got to find a way to make them work. It says if we get this right, we'll be richer and think differently about ourselves as a country. It's not just about a benefit to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to find that reconciliation between the two. All of us benefit. There's a prize for every single Australian if we get this right. So for me, I just think there's a level of pragmatism, there's a level of generosity, and there's a level of vision for what we can actually be as a country that shines through from the Uluru Statement, which makes it, such an important document.
Thanks. Perhaps one more, if anyone's got one.
I think Eliza was going to say something, eh?
Yeah, sorry. I was
Okay.
just on the back of what Ruben was talking about the dual sovereignty. I was kind of wondering if there was an idea of what that would look like, or if that's something that's going to be developed as you go forward with the campaign.
Oh, look, the campaign's not. No, don't thrust the responsibility of fixing the dual sovereignties on my campaign. I've got enough problems. No, but it's a good question. I'm gonna probably answer it in a different way than maybe what you'd expect. But this is, if we just forget about the technicalities of a legal reckoning of those sovereignties, talk about what I think the human experience might be when we're at that point. One thing is every single Australian speaks an Australian language. So we speak English and we speak a language of this country. And that's something that all of us do. And we do it as a matter of, that's just what it means to be an Australian. And for everybody else, the best way I can describe it is when I go home, I go back to Minjerribah, I go back to Stradbroke Island, and I've been away for a long, long time. I don't even have to get on the island because our country actually starts on the mainland, and then the water, and then there's the land. But you get onto that country, and I just know that that's my spirit. I just know that that's my home. I can feel it through the soles of my feet. It comes through like electricity, and it's this. It's a very hard emotion to describe, and I miss it now because I haven't been able to go home for quite some time. But it is the most. It's the most safe and whole I feel as a person when I put my feet on that country, because I can feel my story connected to the mother. It's a physical thing. It's a spiritual thing. It's an emotional thing. It is absolutely within the possibility that every single Australian has that feeling themselves. They feel that themselves. They have that connection to this country. Yes, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples will have a special connection. We'll always have a special connection because we've been connected to that story for too many millennia for it not to be a special connection. But every other Australian can feel that too, and not apologise for it and say, no, that's just what the blackfellas feel. That's part of what it means to be of this nation. So that's for me what the what sovereignty will feel like. A connectedness that perhaps we haven't been able to enjoy yet. That every single Australian, whether you've been here 6 generations, 6 years, or 6 minutes, that's what you feel. If you know no other country, this is your place. That's what you feel. That's the best way I can describe it in a real sense.
Dean, I think that's a wonderful place to actually end this evening. It's been terrific having you, and Jess is going to thank you in a minute, but could I just say that you are following in the footsteps of Marcia Langton tonight, who did the first Indigenous Oration for us, followed by an eminent Canadian First Nations man, John Burrows, who is a constitutional lawyer. And then last year we had Professor Pirima from New Zealand, who's a Maori scholar. And what struck me, and I think you touched on this, is that we can also learn lessons, I think, from other nations where perhaps they've moved ahead of us. We can learn from one another. And I wish Sean had been with us tonight, because he's involved in a peace and reconciliation network that encompasses a number of different countries. And I know that Marcia has done this in the past as well. I think 90% is a great result. We shouldn't be fearful of a constitution. I think in 1967, 90% voted in favour. We seem to keep pulling back because we say that constitutions don't get up in Australia. But before I sign off, could I just say all the best with your campaign? Send us through the links, and you know, I'm sure some of the students would be happy to get involved. On behalf of myself, I'd just like to thank you. This wasn't quite what we thought the evening would be when we arranged it last year. We look forward to perhaps having you come to the college when conditions permit, and we can continue this discussion. And we hope by that stage you'll be further down the track as well. But let me hand you over to Jess and to give a vote of thanks. Thanks everyone for coming this evening. And it has been recorded, so it will go out to a wider audience. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Drew.
Thank you. Mr. Dean Parkin, our Chairman, and our most valued invited guests and students. It's my privilege to be asked to provide a vote of thanks for this evening. I'm a Darug woman and the Indigenous Student Support Officer here at Queen's, and I wish to extend thanks on behalf of myself and the college to Dean for his time and efforts tonight, for sharing with us your role in the creation of the Uluru Statement and how it's imperative that Indigenous Australians possess this voice within Parliament to provide a say in which laws and policies affect us most, particularly to do with the incarceration rates of our peoples and education reforms. I understand that this is only just beginning and we still have a long journey ahead of us. I'd also like to extend my thanks to Stephen Wiley for all his efforts in organising this special event this evening, and to Stuart Gill for chairing. So yeah, thank you everyone for attending. I'll pass back over to Stuart for final remarks.
Thanks, Jess.
Thank you so much.
I think you've summed it up very well, Jess. Thanks again, Dean, and all the best. And I wish everyone a wonderful evening, and look forward to us coming together again around some of these issues in the not too distant future. Thanks, Dean.
Thanks a lot, Stuart. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dean.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Dean.
Cheers, guys.
Great.